Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In today's webinar, Everett Fritz will discuss how we can develop ministries in our parish to meet the needs of individuals. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Ministry Resources and Special Initiatives Manager at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. Questions can be sent to our presenter using the GoToWebinar panel here that you see, and I will read as many of those questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you via email tomorrow. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Everett Fritz is founder and executive director of Andrew Ministries, a nonprofit devoted to training parishes in discipleship and family-based youth ministry. He has more than 15 years of experience in youth ministry. He is also the author of Freedom, The Art of Forming Young Disciples, co-author of Uncompromising Purity, and his latest book, author of One Disciple at a Time. Fritz has been a regular guest on EWTN, Catholic Answers Live, and numerous podcast and radio programs. He has spoken all over the country, presenting on discipleship through missions, retreats, and workshops for dioceses, parishes, schools, and organizations. Fritz earned an associate's degree from Holy Cross College here at Notre Dame, Indiana, a bachelor's degree in theology from Franciscan University of Steubenville, and a master's degree in theology with concentrations in catechesis and evangelization from the Augustine Institute. Everett, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to do this.
Absolutely.
Thanks everybody for joining too.
Yes, we're excited too. I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
Okay.
All right.
Showing my screen. There we go.
All right, you can take it from here.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming to the webinar this morning or this afternoon. Gosh, I don't even know what time it is. There's my passion in the church in terms of who I serve. I work with young people, and the reason why I work with young people is that my heart breaks for all of those leaving the church. The statistics are out there. We lose, for every one person we bring into the church, we're losing 7. But in general, the fastest growing religious denomination is none or not affiliated. When people leave the church in general, they leave it young, which is why I love working in youth ministry. It's a huge mission field. And the reality is the kinds of conversations that we're having in the church right now, which is around the topic of moving into an apostolic age, of the fact that we can't be continuing to rebuild Christendom. There's all kinds of different conversations that are being had around the subject matter of why are we losing people and what do we need to do differently, moving from maintenance to mission. I mean, these are hot buzzwords in ministry circles. The long story short is, if we don't do something, we don't change the way that we do ministry, the conversations we're going to be having in 30 or 40 years are, what do we do with the empty churches that we have to close? If you just look at the way the stats are playing out, they're not going to be sustainable long term. We have to think differently around ministry. We have to think differently around the ways that we've been doing things. Otherwise, things will not change. When I talk around ministry, when I do ministry training for people, I will frequently talk around the subject matter of focusing in on one, which seems counterintuitive because we have been given the message by Jesus Christ, the gospel message, to be taken out to the entire world, the Great Commission of go make disciples of all nations. And if we go and make disciples of all nations, that's a lot of people, and we're responsible for a lot of people. But the temperament that it takes to really make a lifelong follower of Jesus Christ, there's a movie that I saw like not 30 years ago. I'm not that old. There's a movie that I saw recently that talked about a card trick that a guy played out over the course of 30 years. The movie was Now You See Me, and it was just a story that was told of a legendary magician who, when he was 14 years old, some high-ranking official in the government had come to his town, and he did a card card trick for him, sleight of hand. He had him write his name in the middle of the card, and then he made the card disappear, and it was no longer in the deck. And the man congratulated him on his trick, his sleight of hand, etc., and went on his merry way. But the kid, the whole purpose of doing that trick was not to impress the guy with this sleight of hand tricks. He wanted to get the guy's signature on a card. And he took that card and he put it in the like a knot of a tree. And over the course of many, many years, that tree grew around the card. And then about 30 years later, the same guy comes back to the town, now even higher up in the government. And now this guy is a grown man, as a magician. He says, "Hey, can I do a card trick for you?" And meanwhile, the guy has long forgotten about the card trick that was done 30 years ago. And using sleight of hand, he has him pull out the same exact card that he pulled out 30 years prior, write his name in the exact same place, made the card disappear. And he says, "Now your card is growing in the middle of that tree." He says, "Cut down that tree and you will find your card." And sure enough, they cut down the tree and they found growing in the middle of the tree the card with his signature on it. And everybody was amazed. I mean, the magician from that day forward became legendary. They're like, "How did he do it? Like, how in the world did he get a card to grow in the middle of a tree?" That it was just amazing. What they didn't know is that it was the card from 30 years prior. And so he had this plan, this idea of like of letting something play out slowly over the course of time and just letting it unfold to the point of then creating this awe-inspiring moment, which grabbed everybody's attention. I like to think this is the way Jesus operated. Like if you look at, I find his relationships right now in the way that I'm praying with the scriptures, I'm paying a lot of attention to his close friendships and relationships in the scripture. And in particular, I'm always interested in his relationship with Simon Peter. Because if you look at Jesus's plan was always to take the gospel to all nations, was always that the Gentiles would be brought back in. It was always that the gospel would spread rapidly around the world. And his plan worked. Like it spread rapidly after the resurrection. However, Jesus never left Israel. In fact, he stayed in a very small circle of like in terms of his location, he never left anywhere. And even if you look at his large group ministry, the Sermon on the Mount is the greatest sermon that he ever gave. And in that sermon, he famously talks about love your enemies. He talks about the Beatitudes. He talks about, adultery within the heart. And nowhere within that sermon, which is in Matthew's gospel, nowhere does it say that those who heard the sermon became lifelong followers of his. In fact, if anything, they were probably turned off. They were expecting a Messiah that would tell them to go kill their enemies and take back the city of David and Jerusalem for the people of Israel, to overthrow the Romans. That's what they wanted of the Messiah. And in fact, what Jesus says is love your enemies. I mean, it's a very different message than they were expecting. In fact, you could even say Jesus's large group ministry was largely unsuccessful. At the end of the day, it was the crowds who were the ones responsible for killing him. The crowds eventually turned on him. So what was Jesus's goal within his 3-year ministry? He focused on 12. In fact, the only reason we know what was said in the Sermon on the Mount is because in Matthew wrote it down in his gospel, and Matthew was one of the 12. Um, Jesus's circle of influence was really focused in on 12 people. And even among 12, he had 3, and even among 3, he had 1. That God, when he came up with a perfect plan to conquer the world, said, "We're going to build this on Simon the fisherman, a guy who was not capable, not not studious, not the best of the best, and he got handpicked by Jesus, and Jesus just poured into him over a long period of time." Uh, this is what I mean when I say, like, I have this theory that I call the theory of one, where I say like one saint, one person who becomes a great saint, a great influence, who surrenders to Christ in their life in a radical way, who follows him with their entire heart, who's not perfect but still strives to follow Christ. Like that one person can change the entire world. And you look at great saints like Francis of Assisi or Saint Dominic or Saint Bonaventure or Saint John Paul II or Saint Teresa of Calcutta. They all had an enormous impact on the world, just as the one person that they were. Um, So, our goal shouldn't be to take the gospel to the masses. Our goal should be, how do we actually form one lifelong follower of Jesus Christ, which is, like I said, counterintuitive. Uh, when I train ministry leaders, I like to do an exercise with them where I say, look, imagine your pastor. So say you're working for a pastor, you're a DRE, youth minister, you're a volunteer, whatever the case may be. Maybe you are a pastor on this call yourself, your bishop comes to you. But whoever's in charge of ministry in your community comes to you and says, hey, whatever ministries you're doing right now, whatever responsibilities you have, whatever work that you're doing for the church, I'm actually going to take that off your plate right now and give it to somebody else. And you no longer have to, like, everything you're responsible for, you no longer have to worry about it. I have a new job description. This job description is extremely important, and that's why I'm entrusting it to you, because I trust you. And your new job description is so important. I'm going to double your salary. Let's say you work for the church. Now, maybe you don't work for the church. Maybe you're a volunteer. You're like, I don't make anything anyway. Double doesn't make a difference. But what I'm trying to communicate is this has huge value. And your pastor says to you, you have as long as you need to execute the one goal of this job description. Your new job description is to make one lifelong follower of Jesus Christ and his church, one great saint. What would your ministry look like if you only had to focus in on one? Let's say you're like the magician who has 30 years to let it play out and unfold. If you only had to focus on one person for 30 years, what would your ministry look like? And the reason why I have ministry leaders do this exercise, I actually have them write out, like, how would my ministry look if I only had to focus on one person? Like, what does the invitation look like? What does our conversation look like? Where do we meet? What does the environment look like in terms of where we meet? Like, what's our conversation look like? What's really essential for that person to learn, and how do they learn it from us? I have them like map all that out, and I say, look, what you've just identified as you map this out is what it actually takes to make a disciple of Jesus Christ. Now I want you to take that list of the things that you know are important, and compare it to what you're doing in ministry now. And in all likelihood, it looks entirely different than what you're currently doing in ministry. So what you've just identified is, here's what it actually takes to make a disciple, and here's what we're actually doing. And there's an enormous gap in terms of, like, what we're doing isn't meeting the needs of this one individual person. This is not the way Jesus operated. Jesus didn't just give us the message of the gospel, he taught us how to communicate it, because Jesus figured out his plan for conquering the world was, I'm going to take Simon and I'm going to make him into Peter. And once I have done that, then I can move from 1 to 3, and then 3 to 12, and 12 to 72, and so on and so forth. And it spread rapidly when he did so. Um, so this is in large part what I do in coaching ministry professionals, is I'm trying to get them to understand what it actually takes, and then to create ministry that meets the individual needs of a person. Like, actually think through, who is it that we're called to minister to? Who is it that my heart breaks for? What is my approach going to be to invite those people into ministry, to go out and find them, etc. I want to actually highlight three things that I think are important. There's a book that we're going to talk about at the end here that I wrote with Ave Maria Press called One Disciple at a Time. I talk about more than just these three things, but I want to highlight three that I think are absolutely important to always think about in terms of ministry. The first being the invitation. And this is something that I think we sorely lack within Christianity, is the actual just basic invitation. Because if your ministry was only focused on one person, the first step is just figuring out, well, how do I invite that person into some kind of relationship? Now, this person, you can identify any person you want. Maybe you already have a relationship with this person and the invitation is not difficult. But in all likelihood, like, most Catholic ministries don't think through the invitation. We lean heavily on our sacramental programs to bring people into the church, or for people to actually come to us and knock on our door. And we don't actually go out and invite them. Like, Protestants who fill their churches, non-denominational churches, etc., they don't have a sacramental program. People aren't coming and knocking on the door saying, I have a 13-year-old who needs the sacrament of confirmation, or I have a 7-year-old that needs first Holy Communion. They don't have those carrots. in front of them. Now, a sacrament, we're Catholics. We know that the sacrament is much more than a carrot. But I'm saying that just from a system standpoint, non-denominational non-denominational Christians would kill to have what we have in the Catholic Church. People actually knocking on our doors saying, "Form us," and we know we're like, well, yeah, they're saying form us, but they want confirmation. But we all know they just treat it like graduation and they leave the next day after they've received confirmation. It doesn't matter. The fact that people are actually knocking on our door, and because of that we don't have to do an invitation, it demonstrates people are saying, "For my child." We don't have the best of intentions, but they still want their child formed. Catholics don't think through the invitation. Like, what does the actual invitation look like? Because, in all honesty, we've been lazy for many years because we've been in maintenance mode because we haven't had to go out and invite people. That's not going to be the case as the church moves in more and more into the modern age. So, what does the invitation look like? Look, there are all kinds of studies that have been done in fundraising that I know this from having done like missionary fundraising, that a missionary, when they're asking somebody to support their mission, if they do a letter writing campaign, you get a less than 1% return, meaning that however many letters you send out, about 1% or fewer will actually give a donation. If you do a phone campaign where you send a message out, or you call somebody, or you do a group invite, you get a 17% return. But when you do a one-to-one invite and you say, "I want to invite you into my mission," uh, there is a 50% return on investment, meaning that when you are fundraising and you ask a person, you take them out to coffee, you take them out to dinner, you share with them your mission, and you invite them to be part of that mission, half the time somebody will make a donation to the mission. I find that the same is true of an invitation into ministry or an invitation even to the church, that a one-to-one invite has a huge impact in terms of people participating. I'll share with you just a brief story. You know, it was mentioned in the beginning. I know that a lot of my stories tend to be around youth ministry because that's been my background for 15 years. But I had teenagers that I was starting to, that were really catching fire in their faith in the early years of my ministry. And one in particular that I challenged her to actually go out and make disciples. And she was 15 at the time, and she was still being formed in her faith. But what she figured out pretty quickly, she's like, well, I can invite people. I can invite them to youth group. I can invite them to church. And so over the course of the summer, she started inviting, it was like a new friend every week she had at church with her, non-Catholic. uh, Megan was her name, and it was fantastic. It was amazing to watch her invite these people. One day, as I was doing our summer theology of the body study, she brings a new friend, which was nothing uncommon because she was doing that all summer, and his name was Tom. And there was like this buzz in the youth group, like, what is Tom doing here? So I pulled a couple of the teens aside. I'm like, "What are you guys talking about?" They're like, "Well, Tom from school is here." And I was like, "So?" Like, we have new kids all the time, and they're like, "Tom's an atheist." And I was like, "So?" It's not the first time an atheist has walked into a Catholic church. It's just Megan bringing a new friend. They're like, "No, you don't understand. Like, Tom is one of those atheists that's like, he's not just like, I don't believe in God. He's like, I don't believe in God and Christians are stupid." And he was one of those like militant atheists who just hated all things religion and Catholicism and organized. I mean, it was just cynical, etc. And he had this reputation in the school. So for him to be in a church youth group was like, everyone was like, "What is he doing here?" And somebody said, "I know why he's here." And I was like, "What? Why is Tom here?" They said, "Well, he's got a crush on Megan." And I was like, "Oh, good job, Megan. Way to use those um, gifts that God has given you to bring people into the kingdom." Anyway, so Tom shows up, and sure enough, we are talking about Pope John Paul II's theology of the body. I was like, I'm going to scare him away. Like, within a week, he won't come back next week. But the following week, he was back for the next study, and then the next study, and then the next, and he was there every single week. And by the end of the summer, Tom pulls me aside and he says, "Hey, I need to talk to you. How do I become Catholic?" And I was like, "Tom, like, that's a heck of a crush you got. Like, just because you like a girl doesn't mean you gotta like become her religion to impress her. Like, let's talk about what your intentions are here." And he says, "No, no, no." He says, "It has nothing to do with Megan." He says, I've been listening all summer, and I've realized that what you're saying is true, and I want to give my life to it." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, what an amazing conversion." So I was like, we're not set up was a very small parish. We were not set up with an RCIT program. I was like, well, I'll put you in RCIA. I was like, surely they'll scare you away. And this is, I wasn't real optimistic about our quality of ministry in the parish. You can tell by my attitude. But I was like, this is not. I was like, I just want to help this kid, but I don't want to put him in an environment where he doesn't belong. Um, anyway, the short of it is he went through RCIA, and there was a moment when he came on a retreat with us that fall, and his story came out on retreat. And if I found out that Tom had been depressed most of his life, or at least was going through a bout of depression, that he felt like there was something hugely missing in his life. And there was a night when he decided to take his own life that summer. And his plan was to go to the high school, climb up to the top of the bleachers, which were very high up, and throw himself over the top to his death. And he climbed up to the top of the bleachers. He wrote a suicide note, left it at home, went to the high school, climbed up to the top of the bleachers, took his phone out for some reason and put it on the bleachers. And right as he was about to jump, his phone buzzed because it was ringing. And he looked down at it, and it was Megan. And he picked up the phone and he said, Megan, he said, hello. And Megan says, "Hey Tom, I just want to know, like, will you come to me with you to youth group with me tomorrow?" And he said, "Okay." And he hung up the phone, got back in his car, and went home. And the next day was the day that I met Tom. Like, Megan literally saved his life, and all she did was extend an invitation. Like, these one-to-one invites can be very powerful, and we have no idea how many people we're missing out on by not extending those invitations. Most ministries, when they're creating ministries, they're not thinking about, like, what does the invitation look like? The standard ministry invitation for something new that's being launched in a parish is to put it in the bulletin or maybe do a pulpit announcement. And that's akin to taking a flyer about the new program you're launching and climbing up to the top of a skyscraper and throwing it out over and hoping that it lands in the hands of the people that are actually needing to come to the ministry. Like, it's not an invite. Just because we think we're sending it out to the masses, it was in the bulletin. How come they didn't respond? We put it in our email flock note. We put it out on social media. Nobody sees those things. That's not a personal invitation. The communication of, hey, you're important to me, and there's something that I want you to come and see. That makes a big difference. So the invitation is important. Second, the experience and witness. Um, if you look at the way Jesus formed the apostles, uh, it always amazes me how often there's a catechetical moment where he could teach and he skips over it, or he just kind of leaves them hanging, like the bread of life discourse. He talks about, you need to eat my flesh and drink my blood. He's teaching the crowds, and the crowds are confused, and the crowds eventually leave him. And rather than turning to the apostles and saying they didn't understand, like, what I really meant is, I'm going to be instituting something called the Mass, the Eucharist. We're going to be, we're going to have a rite, and the bread will turn into my body. He just leaves it hanging. And he actually poses it to them. And he's like, are you going to leave me too? And they said, Master, to whom shall we go? Like, they didn't understand what it was that he was talking about. I mean, in all likelihood, they were very concerned. They're like, we just lost the crowds. But he just leaves it hanging. And then maybe what, a year later at the Last Supper, he holds up the bread and he says, this is my body, this is my blood. Like, it takes a year or so for them to come back to it. He doesn't always take advantage of those catechetical moments. He lets things unfold through shared experiences. There's a moment where he does teach the apostles after his resurrection, where they have breakfast together, where but leading up to that, he recalls for them a shared experience that they were out fishing on the sea. This is post-resurrection, and the man calls out to them, hey, throw out your net. On the other side. He's like, did you catch anything? And they said, no, we fished all night, we caught nothing. Throw out your net on the other side. And they do so, and they catch a huge amount of fish. And Peter immediately exclaims, it's the Lord, and jumps out of the boat and swims to shore. And they haul in the fish and they have breakfast. And then it says in the Gospels that Jesus started to reveal to them and talk to them about the events, basically, of previous days. And Uh, why did Peter know, however, that it was the Lord? It's because Jesus recalls for him the exact same experience. Like the day that Peter met Jesus was the day he performed that exact same miracle to him. And so, what does he do to reintroduce himself to the apostles from the shore? He does it again. He recalls for them, here's an experience that we had together. I'm going to recall it for you, so you know exactly who I am. There's a reality that shared experiences are more powerful than anything we could ever teach or instruct. It's also true that somebody who gives witness, you can't argue with somebody's witness. When somebody says, uh, well, we'll put it this way, you can have a teacher get up in front of a class and they can say to the class, it is not, it is a sin against the virtue of uh, temperance, of gluttony, to drink too much, it's a sin against your mind to be a drunkard. And that typically will go in one ear and out the other with a class of people, whether they're adults or teenagers or whatever. It's much more powerful for someone to get up in front of an audience and say, I was a drunkard, and here's how Jesus changed my life. And now I'm not anymore. And here's how my life is more fulfilled because of it. No one can argue with that witness. If they say, my life is more fulfilled because I follow Christ and I've turned away from sin, that is so much more powerful than someone just saying, here's why this sin is wrong, according to our teachings that have been given to us by Jesus. Witness and experience would be so, I would lean into that so much more if I'm just focused on making one disciple. There's a reality that people need encounter with Christ. I know I was talking recently to, I was having a conversation with somebody who was a therapist who was not a Christian. She was actually a fallen away Catholic. We got just random person got into a conversation with, and we started talking about prayer. And she said to me, she's like, "Oh, I still pray." And I said, "Oh, how do you pray?" And she's like, "Well, I meditate." I was like, "Oh, tell me how you meditate." And she started to describe to me like basically mindfulness exercises. Like, well, I imagine myself in water and there's a stream and and it's very calming. And I was like, that's beautiful. That's really amazing. But that's not prayer, at least not the way that I would understand it as a Christian. And she says, well, how would you describe prayer? I said, prayer is an encounter with a person. That we believe that God is not some sort of distant being, but that he wants a relationship with us. And therefore, when I pray, I'm in conversation with a person who I love. Um, that's the way I describe prayer. Um, it's amazing to me how often I speak with Catholics or even other Christians who, when they talk about their faith, they don't talk about, I'm like, hey, how did you come to faith? And they don't talk about their encounter with Jesus Christ. And I start to say, well, wait, do you have a relationship with Jesus Christ? Like, how can you be a Christian without being able to speak to your relationship with a person? Um, Jesus resurrected from the dead. He's not dead, he's alive. And when people are alive, you can have a relationship with them. Um, I think about all the 16 years I've done in ministry and moments of encounter that people have had when I'm ministering to them, when I'm in relationship with them, when I'm meeting with them on a weekly basis. And they can be something really powerful, like we go on a retreat together and there's a moment where they have an encounter with Jesus in the Eucharist or adoration. But there are also times when I've been in just random conversation with someone and they bring up a wound and we start to talk around that wound. And I say something simple about Jesus's love, and there's a moment of just like encounter for them to all of a sudden have truth spoken into their wound for the first time, and there's it leads them to reconciliation with the Lord or whatever the case may be. Uh, I cannot imagine somebody coming to faith without having encounter. Um, the knee-jerk reaction when I do ministry training is a lot of people like to think of like, hey, what our young people just need in order to practice the faith, because we're losing young people over the place, is better catechesis. They need better catechesis, stronger catechesis. I don't disagree with that. But my first response to people when they say we need better catechesis for our young people is to say, would it surprise you to know that I know many very well catechized adults who've walked away from the faith? Uh, and uh, that it was not a lack of catechesis, it was lack of a relationship with Christ. Now, the truth is, if you're doing good catechesis, it should include encounter. But we can't simply instruct people into the faith and say, here are our teachings. And if people just knew covenant theology, or they just understood the liturgy and its depth, or they just understood um, the Thomas Aquinas's proofs for the existence of God, that's sufficient enough for them to become a lifelong follower. No, they need a relationship with Christ, first off and foremost. So encounter for me is an absolutely essential part of a formation of somebody to become a lifelong follower of Jesus Christ. The final thing I'll say is that there is a need for imitation of a rabbi. This is what I would call discipleship. Discipleship is a hot buzzword in the church right now. It is a word that has been thrown around all over the place. A very popular book by Sherwood Elds called Forming Intentional Disciples. Because of that, people are talking about discipleship, and it drives me up a wall when I hear the term discipleship used out of context. Discipleship is a particular method of formation where a rabbi would go to the class, the graduating class, and he would evaluate each of the graduates one-on-one. And he would extend one of two invitations to them. He would either say to them, go and learn the trade of your father, or he would say to them, come and follow me. And if he said, come and follow me, then you had the opportunity of a lifetime to study under a rabbi. But his instruction wasn't for more formal teachings or classes. His instruction was for you to come and live with him and learn from his very example. In fact, the old saying was that if you were a good disciple, at the end of the day, you'd be covered in the dust of your rabbi, because you were following so closely to the rabbi that dust from his sandals would be kicked up and cover you, and so that you were, by the end of the day, you were covered in his dust. Like, the whole idea of discipleship was that it was small, it was a very intentional relationship, and it was mentorship, apprenticeship in the life of a Jew. And so, actually, if you look at Jesus's first invitation, and when he says to Peter, fishing out on the sea, he says, "Come and follow me." What is Peter doing when Jesus comes and finds him? He's doing the trade of his father. Like, his opportunity had come and gone, and the rabbi said, "You are not the best of the best," and he didn't get that invite. And so, it, you might look at that gospel passage and say, it is really strange that he just dropped his nets. They left their father in the boat and they just went and followed him from that day forward, from the simple invitation of come and follow me. But what was being extended to them was the opportunity of a lifetime to study under a rabbi who they soon found out was the Messiah, like the rabbi above all rabbis. And the apostles learned from his very example, which means that the apostles didn't only learn the teachings that Christ gave him, they learned by his example in terms of the way that God himself brushed his teeth in the morning, and what his daily routine looked like, and how he dealt with difficult people in difficult situations, and how God told a joke. They got to learn from that. If you look at John's account of the resurrection, when they get to the tomb, John pays very specific attention to detail in his gospel, and he throws in some lines that are always really like, why did you include that line? Like, there are times in a gospel where he might say it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it's like, well, who cares? Like, why did you include that in your gospel? But it's very intentional. There's a moment in where John runs to the tomb, but he waits for Peter to catch up, and Peter goes in first, and he looks around, and it says specifically in John's gospel, they did not understand, but they saw and they believed. And there was a point in there, I was like, well, how is it that they didn't understand, but they saw and believed? And there's a point in there where John actually says, here's what the tomb looked like. The burial cloths were in one place, but the headcloth was folded up in a corner. And it occurred to me, and I don't know if I'm right on this, but it occurred to me that because the apostles lived with Jesus, they would have known the way in which Jesus folded his clothes. And by seeing the headcloth folded up in the corner, perhaps he had a way in which he folded his clothes, which was very unique to him. And the fact that it was folded up in that way, it occurred to them that we don't know how it's possible, but we know he's alive again because only Jesus folded his headcloth or his clothes in that way. And that came to me in prayer one time, and I thought it was interesting. Some scriptural scholar might get on there and be like, "No, that's wrong," which is fine. You can call me a heretic later, but there's there's a reality that I think that there's a ton that is learned by imitation of the rabbi. Like I've in my life, I can say that there are uh, three different men that have played a huge role in the development of my faith, and in the case of all three, it wasn't what they taught me; it's how they lived their lives that really inspired me. Um, and moments where I can say that giving witness to or just imitating their example led me to a closer relationship with Jesus Christ. The opposite of witness, of imitation, of shared experience is hypocrisy. Like if witness gives it does more to help the church or help form somebody than anything else. Hypocrisy is the opposite of it. It's someone who says, do as I say, not as I do, meaning that they don't give witness by the way they live their life. They actually live their life an opposite. This is one of the reasons why the church has been so damaged by the church sexual abuse crisis, is that it's hypocrisy to the nth degree. And that does a tremendous amount of damage because it's the opposite of witness. Witness is what brings people close. Hypocrisy drives them away. Pope Paul VI talks about witnesses. He says, modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers. And if he does listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses. So this is nothing new in the church. Like Pope Paul VI has talked about these concepts. Pope John the 23rd has talked about them. John Paul II certainly talked about them. Like our popes and our church leaders have been talking about the need for witnesses for quite some time. But the reality is, like, we're not paying that close of attention. I want to close the webinar before we move to Q&A by talking about a man by the name of Jan Taranowski, who I believe had one of the greatest impacts on the history of the 21st century, positive impacts. His cause is currently being studied for canonization. He's Venerable Jan Taranowski. He was a tailor that grew up in Poland from the year 1900 to 1947. He lived in Krakow, Poland. He was just known as being a holy man of God, being a layperson. He had an extraordinary prayer life. It was inspired by the spiritual classics. In particular, he had a love for the Rosary and Mary and for the spiritual classics of John the Cross. Well, when the Nazis took over Poland, they were afraid. We know they put Jews in concentration camps. They also put anybody in a camp that they would find threatening. And people who worked with young people, who maybe would run a youth movement, they would find threatening. So in the case of Taranowski's parish, the priests stopped doing the youth programs because they didn't want to be, they either were thrown into the camp or they didn't want to be thrown into the concentration camp. So Taranowski took it upon himself to say, you know what, I'm going to mentor 5 young men. And he just had an informal relationship with them, but he met with them. He personally invited them into this small group, and then he mentored them. And he mentored them in the spiritual classics and the Rosary, but they also went on camping trips together. He became like another father figure for them. He mentored their prayer lives. He mentored their wounds in the hard times, and they formed deep relationships with each other. Eventually, he challenged these 5 young men to go out and form younger high school students the way that he was doing it with them. So they had like 60 young men all together in these 5 small groups, and they became known as the Living Rosary. Of those 60 young men, 10 became Catholic priests. And one of the original 5 young men that was mentored by Jan Taranowski was a young man by the name of Karol Wojtyla, who, of course, is better known by his name, Pope St. John Paul II. His papal mantra when he was Pope was Totus Tuus Maria, meaning Mary, I'm thine, and all I have is thine. He wrote his theological doctoral dissertation on the spiritual works of St. John the Cross, which John the Cross was very much about finding Christ within the suffering. And if you look at John Paul II's papacy, he gives witness to finding Christ within the suffering. Uh, one of the priests who was ordained alongside of Wojtyla, who was also one of the original 5, he said, Jan's influence on Karol was gigantic. I can safely say, if it wasn't for him, neither Wojtyla nor I would be priests. So Jan Taranowski had a huge impact on the 21st century because he formed one lifelong follower of Jesus Christ who went on to become a great saint that impacted the world. And Taranowski's fingerprints on Karol's life, his spirituality, his his devotion, the way that he ended up ministering to people by taking young men and women on camping trips, etc. Like Taranowski's fingerprints were all over that. And all he did was focus on the people in front of him. Like making ministry so simple as to say, I'm just going to focus on building the kingdom of God with the handful of people that I've got access to. There's a reality that I said, like, what would your ministry look like if you only had to focus on one person? We don't do that because it's unrealistic. Like, no past job description, make one disciple. That's not realistic. But it's counterintuitive to say, like, how am I going to meet the individual needs of a person? The reality is that we need more people to be reaching out and doing the work of discipleship. And in order to do that, we have to focus in on a handful and work on multiplication because it's not a movement that can be large in the beginning. So, how do you build the kingdom of God? You got to focus in on one person at a time. This is not anything new. It's what John Paul II did, it's what Mother Teresa did. It's how she started her missionaries of charity. She focused on one dead, dying person in the streets of Calcutta. And eventually, this movement started. The same needs to be true is that so much of what we do within the church, so much of what God has taught us is counterintuitive. It's like an oxymoron. How do you live forever? You must die first. You must go through the doorway of death in order to get to resurrection. Um, it's the same as true. Like, how do we build the kingdom of God and reach the masses? We have to focus on one person at a time. So I'm going to hand things back over to Aaron. Real briefly, my name is Everett Fritz. Again, I founded a ministry called Andrew Ministries. I work with people on building ministries that are focused in on the work of discipleship. My website's andrew-ministries.com. So I mentioned that simply to plug my own ministry. And Aaron, I'm going to hand it back to you to run Q&A.
Yes, gotcha. Okay, thank you so much, Everett. I will definitely include the link to your site and the follow-up email also tomorrow for all of you. So thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about and also quite inspiring. I invite anybody to submit questions for Everett at this time. So as you were talking, I was thinking about how since COVID, the big challenge or the big conversation is how do we get people back into the parish, back into the pew? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's. I think one of the reasons why people don't focus small is because it's so time consuming. And the reality is, I think the parishes that bounce back as quickly as possible were the ones who took a step back when the pandemic hit and said, okay, the world is different. Like, mid-March, all of a sudden the reality of the world changed for everybody in the world. That's never happened in my lifetime, where it was like one day the world was one way and the next day it was completely different for every single person in the world. And the ministries that excelled during that time, whether they were parishes, schools, institutions, whatever, they were the ones who took a step back and they said, what are the needs of the people now, today, versus what they were yesterday? The ones who failed were the ones who said, how do we take our current programs and move them online? Uh, and it was like, okay, you like, that's not the way ministry works. Like, you cannot program the transformation of the human heart. So I think that there are a variety of Catholic ministries that have come out of the pandemic better, and their congregations have come back because they did the hard work of saying, you know what, we're going to call. I mean, I know many parishes that called every single parishioner in their parish and reached out to them individually, which I'm sure they've never done in their life. But all of a sudden, it's like, well, all of our programs are gone, so we're going to put our staff to good use and get them on the phones, calling people, finding out how they're doing, reaching out to them, and figuring out, like, what do they need in this time. I'll tell you that my own home parish, they identified pretty quickly, hey, nobody's getting the sacraments, which that was the case for everybody. And they said, eventually there was a rule that within our town you could have outdoor gatherings, but you had to stay 6 feet apart. That was the first allowance that was made when we were coming out of the pandemic. So they said, okay, we're moving mass outside. And they built an outdoor shrine and they said Sunday Mass is now going to happen, but we've built these boxes. They roped them off more than 6 feet apart. Bring your lawn chairs, and we'll do Mass for you. And they did that throughout the entire rest of the pandemic. For 2 years, they only did Mass outside. So you might think,
Mm.
well, what did they do during the winter? They bought space heaters
Wow.
and had propane tanks that parishioners paid for and donated. And they said, we're going to light your propane tank and get under a space heater. And it doesn't matter if it's snowing or if it's 10 degrees outside, we're doing Mass. They identified the needs of their people, right?
Mhm.
Those were the places that excelled. So if you're saying, okay, well, we didn't do that. I mean, that was the only parish in the Denver area that did something like that. But pretty quickly, it became the hot spot for Mass because people who were look, I've worked for parishes for 15 years. I know how little they clean. Like I said to my wife, I was like, I don't feel safe. Like we have special needs kids, autoimmune issues. I was like, I don't feel safe, even though the churches are opening back up, going to an indoor Mass because I know they're not doing all the things they're supposed to be doing. I said, but I do feel safe going to that outdoor place.
Mhm.
So that's the kind of mentality it takes, I think, to get people back in the pews is to take a step back and start to saying, who are the people we're called to minister to and what are their needs today? And that can start with saying, like, we need to do an invitation campaign. We need to identify like who it is that are the people that I said this that we did a listening session in my parish as part of the Synod for Synodality, which a lot of parishes did that. And I asked in the listening session, I just raised my hand and I said, hey, what's the profile of the person that we're ministering to in this parish? And they were like, what are you talking about, profile? I was like, describe for me, who's our typical parishioner? And they couldn't do it. I was like, well, you haven't done the work to actually identify. I was like, you're just trying to minister to everybody, which means that
Mhm.
you're ministering probably to nobody because you only have so many assets and so much. You got to start with saying like, who is it that we're actually called to minister? What are they like? What are the things that they like? What's the kind of music they like? How do they dress? What's their day in, day out challenges in life? And then start to craft a ministry according to that person. And then you might build another profile. But you got to start by asking the question, what do our people need?
Mhm.
And who is it that we're actually called to minister to? And that's the starting point for any kind of good, solid ministry.
Mhm. Thank you. We've got a question here. How would you develop a discipleship ministry in a parish while maintaining other evangelistic programs and efforts?
Well, I think it all depends on what kind of evangelistic programs and efforts you're already doing, because that will tell me, how stretched thin is your volunteer base. The reality is if you're building a discipleship focused ministry, it's small in focus, meaning that I've seen, look, I've got youth ministries that I've coached that have 30, 35 small groups, 300 teenagers participating, but the scope is small in their focus. The idea is two adult mentors for 6 teenagers, so that they have the time to focus in on the individual needs of those people. So that should be the heart of any discipleship focused ministry is we need people who are going to focus on individuals. And if you're going to devote that kind of time and attention, like the magician who took 30 years to let their trick kind of play out, you got to have people that are willing to take the long journey with a handful of people, which means you got to have adults who get that and volunteers who get that. So I would say you start any ministry by saying, do we have people who get discipleship? And how do we empower those people to get into relationship with others? That's a kind of a broad answer to a very specific question, but um, well, here I can plug my ministry this way. That's what my ministry does. Is it coaches? It coaches. It's kind of like, let's look at your situation. Let's look at like what you've got to work with, and let's look at the programs you've got to maintain because there's a reality that you do have to have some things to serve the masses. But what do we have to work with where we can start a movement, and that movement needs to start small and grow from there, so that we have a ministry that's really focusing in on individual needs. I will say real quickly, there's a lot of parishes that are catching on to the idea of small group ministry,
Mhm.
but not doing it well. Meaning that they're like, oh, we do small. I can't tell you how many parishes I talk to, or even youth ministries that they say, oh, we do small group ministry. We have a small group Bible study that meets on Monday. And I'm like, that's not the same thing as discipleship.
Mhm.
Discipleship, the concept is not that you're learning from a program. The concept is that you're learning from a person, which means that people are vulnerable and they get it. Like very very often, a discipleship focused youth ministry could be focused in on doing a Bible study together, but that in and of itself doesn't make it discipleship. Discipleship is focused in on people learning by imitating another person, which means you got
Mhm.
to have people that are willing to go deeper and further than simply running a program.
Great. Can you give examples of how to create opportunities for encountering Jesus and fostering a relationship with him? How to do
Yeah.
that for an individual or a group?
Yeah, one of the things I like about doing the exercise of focusing on one person is that actually in the Catholic Church, I would say that we've done a decent job of creating encounter opportunities for people. This is where things like youth conferences come from, retreats come from, like a Christ Renews His Parish or Cursillo retreat.
Mhm.
Big, huge, like there is in 2024, there's going to be a national Eucharistic Congress in Indianapolis, Indiana, with 80,000 people. And that is a response to the need of people to really develop a relationship with the Eucharist. The bishops have called for this. That's a great example of what I think the intention there is, an encounter experience
Mhm.
for 80,000 people. Now, the beautiful thing, however, when you focus in on what does an encounter look like for one person is that you don't have to have a big, huge conference or congress or event or retreat or even like a parish mission. It doesn't, I mean, it can be as simple as saying, hey, our parish is doing a parish mission. I'm going to invite a person to come to it with me and bring them to an opportunity to have an encounter. But with an individual, it can be as simple. Like I know my wife was mentoring a young woman many years ago who had all kinds of wounds in her life, and they had kind of a breakthrough conversation. And my wife said, "Hey, let's go to the Adoration Chapel, and I just want you to pray in front of the Eucharist." And she did, and it was like this life-changing encounter that happened in that moment, in just a simple moment of saying, I'm taking you to the Adoration Chapel. One of the things I talk about in the book, I haven't plugged the book yet, but one disciple at a time, is that the work of encounter is primarily done by the Lord. Like you can bring people to an opportunity for encounter, but whether or not they have an encounter, it has something to do with their disposition and also whether Christ reveals himself. Like you can't force someone to have a conversation with Jesus Christ and for Jesus to respond. So there is a reality that there are tons of great opportunities for people to have these encounters, and we've kind of learned a formula with it. But the actual work of the encounter with God Himself, um, those moments can come, on an airplane, even in a
Mhm.
conversation. So
Mhm.
um, God, it amazes me what He uses in terms of creating opportunities. And I give several examples in the book of just like random moments with an individual where they had an encounter with Jesus Christ, and I was like, I did nothing, but I just kind of was open to the moment and made a suggestion, and all of a sudden, like the tears start flowing, and I was like, what did I say? Those are moments when like God does that work. So 90% of the work of encounter is God doing it. It's
Yeah,
just helping somebody to be disposed to it.
that's a nice reminder for us about that, for sure. When it comes to the youth of the church, how do you embrace this ministry to the one approach while still maintaining safe environment guidelines?
That's a great question.
Mhm.
And there's a reality that look like safe environment policies in every diocese look different, but there is a reality that one-on-one ministry is not something that is recommended with a young person. I do, I coach discipleship focused youth ministry. So every youth ministry that I coach is small group oriented, where we have two adults with 6 to 8 teenagers. And the goal is for those two adults to work with a group of teenagers over the course of 4, 5, 6 years.
Mhm.
So they build long lasting relationships. But even when I do one on one ministry with a minor, which does happen where a teenager will say, hey, I need to talk to you about something. If it's like an impromptu conversation, I say, great, let's go to this public location into this corner where nobody can hear us, but people can see us. So so that I'm protecting myself. Or I say, hey, can we meet at a coffee shop or a local diner or something of that nature, someplace public where we could still have a private conversation, but do it in a public location. So
Mhm.
even something as simple as like on my office door, I had a less than ideal situation my first 4 years in youth ministry where I was in a separate building from everybody else. And so a young person might come to talk to me, and I said to our maintenance guy, I said, I need a window put on my door. And they did that immediately. And I said, because there are situations where people come in, teenagers come in and they want to talk to me, and it just so happens that we ended up one-on-one. I said, I need somebody to be able to look in the door and see what's going on. So
Mhm.
I think it's a matter of saying you need to be mindful of those things. You can do one-on-one ministry in public locations and still maintain a sense of privacy.
Mhm.
The final thing I'll say with young people is that the better relationship that you can have is with a parent, and the more they understand what it is that you're doing with their teenager in youth ministry, the safer the environment.
Mhm.
So I always made it a point when I'm mentoring teenagers to maintain and try to develop a good relationship with their parents as well.
Mhm. Thank you. How do we help parishioners to move away from the mindset of the parish exists to serve me? Our parishioners tithe very generously, but they tend to view that as a reason to excuse not volunteering.
Yeah. Um, well, praise God that your parishioners tithe. That's not that's a good problem to have. They don't come forward. Look, I'll say this: if they're tithing, hopefully you've got a staff, and then it becomes this. Let me back up, because that's a great question, and I want to give an articulate answer. I know when having worked on a staff where we had a large budget, I never built the ministry around me. My goal was always to build a team so that the ministry was sustainable. And the way I would go out and recruit a team of people that would serve the work of the ministry that we were trying to build is I would recruit my leaders one on one. So it's the same ideas. It's like, how do you get people on board with being invited into the mission? If I was doing a mission ask, meaning, hey, I think you've got gifts and talents that would be really beneficial for this particular ministry that we're trying to build or for our church, I want to invite you into it. It was the same idea as like fundraising, or the same idea as inviting somebody to an encounter experience or into ministry itself. I take them out to coffee. I pitch to them the ministry and why I need their help, and I did one-on-one invites. I remember I was taking over a parish, a large youth ministry, or rather a large youth ministry budget that was a failing youth ministry in a parish in Colorado, and the the I had somebody had built for me coming in a youth ministry committee of parents and experienced people, which was really helpful. And I said, like 4 years in, I'm sorry, I was leaving my parish in Florida where I had worked for 4 years, and I'd built a very large team of adults that was doing the youth ministry. And the way that I did it is my wife and I literally cold called like everybody in the parish, and we were scraping the bottom of the barrel trying to get volunteers into the ministry. But it worked, and I mean, it we built a ministry that way. But it was a ton of work to do one-on-one invites to like every parishioner. So the short of it is, I got to this new parish and I was like asking the committee. I said, "So, does anybody have advice on how I can build a team really quickly?" And there was a guy there that had a extensive on the committee that had an extensive youth ministry background. And he said, "You need to do one-on-one invites." And I was like, "But that's so time consuming." And in the back of my mind, I knew like this is the only way to do it.
Mhm.
He says, "Yeah, but that's how you get the people you want. Is you actually have to
Mhm.
identify them and invite them into ministry." I'll tell you something though uh, to help you with this. You might be hearing this like, okay, well, we've got like our people tithe, they don't volunteer, one-on-one invites, that's very time consuming. But I'll tell you this, in my parish community, I have, you know, it was mentioned at the beginning what my background was. I have a master's degree, I have a bachelor's degree in theology, I serve in ministry, um, been doing so for 15 years in my own home parish. And in my own archdiocese in the last 11 years, do you know how many times I've been invited to do something in ministry? Zero. Never has it ever happened in 11 years that someone in my parish or in my archdiocese has invited me to do something, give a talk, sweep a broom, or push a broom. and no one's ever invited me. And it's not for lack of trying. Like, I've come forward and said, hey, here's my gifts. I'd love to serve. Tell me where I can plug in. I can't necessarily serve in your weekly programs, but I'd love to plug in X, Y, and Z. Still haven't been asked. So I really do believe those people are there, but you're going to have to identify them. A pulpit announcement doesn't do the trick.
You got some comments here with that. I know the feeling, someone said.
Yep. It's a lot of work. It is a lot of work to do when you start to focus one-on-one. It's a lot of work, but once you have that team of people, it does work. Um, yeah. Oh, I'm seeing a slide go up, 25% off.
Yes, yes. So let's talk a little bit. Those who regularly join us on webinars know that we always end with a promo code offering 25% off the book here, using webinar 0517. Everett, tell us how this book could benefit somebody working in ministry.
So yeah, the book is one disciple at a time. There is something that I wrote into the book is I wrote in discussion questions and exercises. So when I first started writing this book, I thought, because I coach so many people in youth ministry and I have so many volunteers that we're recruiting, very often it became apparent to me that people didn't know how to actually minister to a person. And so the concept of this book came out of my mind, where I was like, here's how you actually like, the book is really just a lesson, and here's how you minister to people.
Mhm.
And as I was writing it, however, it occurred, like, my intention was always that hand this to ministry professionals. There's discussion questions at the end of each chapter. They can hopefully create a study group and create a movement. But as I was writing, I realized, I was like, oh, every Catholic can do this. In fact, so the call to action at the end of the book changed from here's how you start a discipleship focused youth ministry, or not youth ministry.
Mhm.
And the call to action at the end of the book changed to go make a disciple, like, whoever you are. And so I mean, we literally have right now, I have people that are purchasing the book, or pastors, and talking about distributing it to everyone in their parish, because they just want to create a movement of people that have the intention of going and finding and identifying one person. So you could use it to train ministry leaders and volunteers. You could use it as a book study. Um, you could use it just to inspire an individual to go make another disciple. So
Yeah.
I see a variety of ways you can use it. Buy it. Buy 2 copies. Give another to a friend. Help my
That's
family
great.
eat. That would be helpful.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, all that you have said has really been super inspiring. I've been getting lots of comments here. Thank you so much. This was one of the best webinars I've attended. Everett is a great
Hey,
speaker, and I will look for his book. Um,
great.
yes, as you're talking about that personal one-to-one invite, it can't just be the handful of ministers in the parish that do that, right? Really,
Yeah.
it's the work of all the people.
Yeah, the reality is, just real quick, the reality is, no pastor, no ministry team, they cannot minister to everybody in the parish, much less the community.
No.
It's the work of everybody. That's how you create disciples on a mass
Mhm.
scale.
Yeah, absolutely. So, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. I invite you to join us again next Tuesday. Gary Zimak will be reflecting on the stories of when Jesus calmed the storm on the sea, how the disciples were afraid, and how we can, some practical ways that we can overcome our own fears by relying on Jesus and learning from his life. So, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Everett. We will see you next week. Have a good evening.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye bye.